Cassaday's Reach kept its silos 300 meters underground, in bedrock older than the colony's paperwork, because the first winter had taught the founders that surface storage was a promise one couldn't keep. There were 400,000 metric tons of processed grain down there on the morning the sky changed color. There were 9 schools, 1 hospital with 40 beds, a courthouse nobody had ever needed to use for anything more serious than a water rights dispute, and 41,206 people, according to the last census, though the number had crept up since, the way numbers do in a place where people keep having children because they believe in the ground under their feet. It went dark in 9 minutes. The Vheshari Concord recorded the whole thing, start to finish, from 4 separate angles, because they intended to show it to someone. The senior observation officer on the lead cruiser was named Threl Asa Voth, and he had been assigned to this operation not because he was senior enough to deserve the honor, but because he wrote clean reports and did not editorialize in them, which the fleet command valued more than they valued opinions. He stood at the tactical rail with his hands folded behind him, the posture his instructors had drilled into him at the academy on Kethis, and he watched the thermal bloom spread across the agricultural basin the way a man watches weather he has already been told is coming. 9 minutes. He timed it on the ship's own chronometer, out of habit, though the strike coordinator had already logged the figure for the report. He did not feel anything in particular. He would remember, later, that this was the part that troubled him most. Not what he'd seen, but the ordinariness of watching it. The strike coordinator, a broad-shouldered officer named Peraz Kolan, who had earned 3 commendations for orbital bombardment precision, turned from his console with the loose, satisfied posture of a man who has finished a difficult crossword. "Message delivered," he said. Threl wrote that down too. Not because it was required, because something in him wanted a record that someone had said it out loud. The Concord's reasoning, laid out in the briefing 3 weeks earlier in a chamber with vaulted ceilings and cold marble floors, had been simple enough that even the youngest attachés could follow it without notes. Humanity was expanding along the frontier at a rate the Concord's demographic analysts found alarming. 31 settlements in 6 years, grain worlds, mining claims, fishing colonies, places with names like Cassaday's Reach and Fenwick Hollow and Ostro's Landing. Small, unglamorous places that did not look like conquest until one added them up on a star chart and saw the pattern. Humanity did not settle capitals, it settled edges. It settled the places nobody else wanted badly enough to defend. And then, quietly, over a generation, those edges became load-bearing. The Concord's High Command had studied humanity for 11 years and concluded, with the confidence of people who have read a great many reports and stood in very few actual rooms with actual humans, that the species was young, sentimental, and reactive, that it prized its individual settlements with an intensity that made it vulnerable to a particular kind of lesson. Strike one colony, a real one, a lived-in one, not a listening post or a border fort, with enough force and enough spectacle that the footage could not be argued with, and humanity would recoil. It would pull back from the frontier, it would consolidate the way frightened things consolidate, and the Concorde would have its buffer zone without the expense of a war it did not, in fact, want. It was, by the Concorde's own internal accounting, an efficient plan. 40,000 lives against the alternative, which their strategists modeled as a drawn-out border conflict, costing considerably more on both sides over the following decade. Efficient, that was the word used in the briefing document. Threl remembered it specifically because it was printed in a clean sans serif font at the top of a slide, above a top-down image of Cassaday's Reach's grain silos, rendered in soft blue and white like an architectural pitch. Nobody in that chamber had asked what humanity would actually do. They had asked what humanity would probably do, run the model, gotten an answer that pleased them, and scheduled the operation. The footage went out on every frequency the Concorde used to communicate with client species and neutral parties. Translated into 11 languages, packaged with a short statement about frontier sovereignty and the consequences of unregulated expansion. It reached human space 4 hours and 12 minutes after the strike. Carried by a relay buoy, the Concorde had, with a kind of grim, theatrical precision, made sure was close enough to human territory to guarantee fast delivery. They wanted humanity to see it soon. They wanted the horror fresh. What they got, in return, over the following 71 hours, was nothing. No formal protest through any of the 6 diplomatic channels that remained technically open. No statement from the Human Systems Governing Council, which had, in the past, issued statements about considerably smaller matters, a fishing dispute, a mining tariff. No panicked evacuation of the other frontier colonies, which Concorde analysts had specifically predicted and had, in fact, budgeted follow-up patrol ships to observe. No public grief broadcasts, no funeral processions on the capital worlds, nothing that the Concorde's intelligence division could point to and call proof that it was working. The frontier colonies did not evacuate. If anything, satellite observation showed increased activity at 3 of them: Fenwick Hollow, Dasson's Crossing, and a mining claim called Toller's Ridge that had, until that week, operated with a skeleton crew of 11. Within 4 days, Toller's Ridge showed 62 new heat signatures. Threll noticed this in the Daily Intelligence Digest and read it twice before he understood what he was looking at. Someone was moving people toward the frontier, not away from it. He mentioned this, carefully, to Colin over a meal in the officers' mess, phrasing it as an observation rather than a concern, because that was the sort of distinction that mattered in rooms like that one. "They're grieving badly," Colin said, around a mouthful of something reconstituted and gray. "Humans do that, circle the wagons. It's a primitive response." "It's an odd primitive response," Threll said, "to move more people into danger. They don't think it's danger anymore. They think we made our point and we're done." Colin said this with total confidence, the confidence of a man repeating something he had heard from someone more senior than himself, which was, Threll reflected later, most of what confidence in a hierarchy actually was. "We're not going to hit them twice. That's not the message. The message was, this can happen. Once was enough." Threll did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had watched the footage of Cassaday's reach 3 more times than he was required to, alone in his quarters, and that somewhere around the 4th viewing, he had stopped seeing a strike and started seeing a schedule. 9 minutes in every silo, every hospital, every school, struck in a sequence too clean to be anything but deliberate. Someone on the Concorde side had wanted maximum coverage, but the human response, the absence of one, had a schedule quality to it too, and it troubled him in a way he did not yet have language for. He wrote a memo. He kept it careful, kept it in the bloodless register that his superiors preferred, framed it as a request for continued intelligence prioritization rather than a warning. Because a warning from an observation officer 3 ranks below the people who needed to hear it would have been filed and forgotten, or worse, would have marked him as unreliable. Recommend continued close monitoring of frontier population movements. Current pattern does not conform to predicted post-strike consolidation behavior. It went into a queue. It was read, eventually, by someone whose job was to read such things, and it was noted, and nothing about the fleet posture changed, because the fleet posture had already been decided by people who trusted their models more than they trusted a junior officer's unease. What none of them knew, what none of the Concorde's analysts, strategists, or high command had access to, because it existed nowhere in any system they had ever managed to compromise, was that the plan they were watching unfold in slow motion had been designed 9 years earlier in a windowless planning annex on a shipyard world called Corvine Station by a woman named Idris Anwin Calloway, who did not hold a military rank and never had. Callaway had been a systems logistician before the frontier settlements existed as more than survey data. The kind of person who thought in supply chains, in failure cascades, who had spent a career quietly noticing that humanity's expansion into hostile or contested space always had the same vulnerability. It looked, from the outside, like sprawl, undefended, sentimental, precisely the read the Concord would eventually make, because it was the read anyone would make, looking only at the surface. She had proposed something to the Frontier Settlement Command that most of them found strange at the time. Not fortification. Fortification announces itself, invites study, gets read and countered. She proposed pattern. Every settlement built to the same civil schematic, the same population curve, the same public infrastructure signature as 100 others already established, so that no outside observer could ever tell, from orbit or from any sensor sweep short of a ground team, which settlements were what they appeared to be and which were something else entirely. Fenwick Hollow was real. Ostro's Landing was real. 40,000 people, wheat and soy and a Tuesday market that had been running for 6 years. Cassaday's reach had been real too. That was the part nobody at Concord High Command had understood, would ever understand until it was far too late to matter. It had not been bait. It had not been a decoy or a sacrifice calculated in advance. It had simply been a colony, ordinary and undefended, that existed on a frontier humanity had chosen, with eyes open, not to armor. Not because we didn't think someone might come, Callaway had said, in a recorded planning session that would not be declassified for another decade, her voice flat and unhurried, in the way of someone who had already made peace with an idea most people found difficult to sit with. Because if we armor everything, we announce that we expect to be hit. And an enemy who expects resistance calibrates. An enemy who doesn't. You're saying we let them choose the target, said a man off microphone, his voice edged with something between disbelief and disgust. I'm saying we don't get to choose who they hit. Nobody ever does. What we get to choose is what happens after. A pause on the recording, the particular kind of silence that exists when a room is absorbing something it does not want to absorb. The fleet doesn't stage on the frontier. That's the whole doctrine. It doesn't matter which colony it is. It matters that when it happens, and it will happen because that's what a frontier is, the response is already built, already staffed, already fueled, and already 3 jumps closer to their capital than they will ever believe is possible. It was not, she had been careful to specify, a plan that depended on any specific colony dying. It was a plan built for the shape of the threat, not the location of it. Cassaday's reach was simply where the Concord strike coordinators, running their own models, running their own efficient calculations, had chosen to land the blow. 9 years of quiet construction had gone into what came next. Shipyards on worlds the Concord's intelligence division had rated as low-priority industrial backwaters, because the yards there produced civilian freight tonnage, according to every manifest anyone had ever managed to intercept, and freight tonnage did not interest a military analyst. Crews rotated through training postings that looked, on paper, like standard merchant marine service. A logistics network built to move fuel, munitions, and personnel across 4 sectors without ever concentrating enough in one place to register as a fleet, because it was never, at any single moment, standing still long enough to be counted. Callaway had died 2 years before Cassaday's reach of an unremarkable illness in an unremarkable bed, having never once given a public interview about what she'd built. Her name appeared on exactly one document that would ever be widely read, a classified operational appendix that a young logistics officer, decades later, would find while researching the history of the frontier response doctrine, and which contained a single line that the officer copied into her own notes because something about it would not leave her alone. We are not building a wall, we are building attendance. When they call the roll, we intend to already be standing there. The order to move did not go out as an order in any sense the Concorde's signals intelligence divisions were trained to recognize. There was no fleet-wide broadcast, no encrypted burst traffic spiking across known human relay networks. None of the signatures that decades of monitoring had taught Concorde analysts to associate with mobilization. What happened instead, over the following 11 days, was that freight traffic patterns across 4 sectors shifted by amounts small enough to be statistically unremarkable on any single day, and enormous in aggregate by the second week. A slow tide rather than a wave, ships that had always been there simply beginning, unhurried, to move in the same general direction. By the time anyone on the Concorde side noticed the pattern, it had already resolved into something they didn't have a category for. The human fleet that assembled at the edge of Concorde space 19 days after Cassaday's reach went dark did not look, on any sensor readout, like a fleet built for vengeance. It looked, Threll thought, standing again at the tactical rail on the day the first contact reports came in, like something that had been finished for a long time and was only now being used. There was no announcement, no ultimatum, no broadcast of demands. None of the performative posturing the Concorde's own doctrine would have called for in the same position. The ships simply arrived, over the course of 6 hours, in numbers that made the tactical officer reading them off stop twice to recheck his instruments. And then they held position at the system's outer boundary and did nothing at all. For 3 days they did nothing at all. It was, Threll would write in a report nobody above him wanted to read, the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed, and he had watched Cassaday's reach burn from orbit. "They're not attacking," Collins said on the second day, with the forced brightness of a man trying to convince himself of something. "Maybe it's a show of force. Maybe it's posturing. They want us to see the size of it and back down from the frontier without a fight." "They already know we've seen the size of it," Threll said. "We saw it a day ago. They're still here." "Then what are they doing?" Threll looked at the readout for a long time before he answered, because he did not want to say the thing he had come to believe, which was that the fleet was not posturing and was not waiting for a Concorde response, and was not, in any way that mattered, interested in whether the Concorde felt threatened. "I think," he said finally, "they're confirming something." What the human fleet was confirming, though no one on the Concorde side would learn this until well after it no longer mattered, was targeting data collected over 11 years by a network of listening posts, trade delegations, and, in 3 documented cases, human colonists who had, entirely without official sanction or knowledge, taken jobs as translators and logistics clerks inside Concorde administrative buildings, and simply paid very close attention for a very long time. Fleet Command was not deciding where to strike. Fleet Command had known where to strike since before Cassaday's reach had a name. What they were doing, in those 3 silent days at the boundary, was verifying that the picture they had built still matched the world. Because a serious plan is a living thing, and one does not execute a 9-year-old blueprint against a moving target without checking it first. The Concorde's core world, Vheshari Prime, had 11 major orbital defense platforms, 4 fleet staging yards, and a planetary shield grid rated to withstand a sustained bombardment from a force roughly the size of the entire Concorde Standing Navy, because no one in Concorde Command had ever seriously modeled an attacker capable of fielding more than that. It was, by every metric the Concorde used to measure military strength, essentially unassailable. It had never occurred to their strategists to model an attacker who did not want to assail it, who had never, in fact, planned to overwhelm the shield grid or trade losses against the defense platforms in the attritional, force-on-force engagement their doctrine assumed was the only kind of war that existed. On the 4th day, the human fleet moved, not toward Vheshari Prime's defenses, around them along vectors that had clearly been calculated against orbital mechanics data no civilian trade mission should ever have had access to. threading gaps in coverage that existed only during specific, narrow windows of platform rotation. Gaps that had been mapped, patiently, over years by people watching from freighters that were never quite where anyone thought to look for them. Threll watched the tactical plot with the particular stillness of a man watching a door he has just realized was never locked. "They're not going for the platforms," said the tactical officer, his voice climbing half an octave. "They're not engaging the fleet yards. They're going around everything." "Around to where?" Collins said. Nobody answered him, because by the time the question left his mouth, the answer was already resolving on the plot, and it was not a place any of them wanted to say out loud. Not the shipyards, not the defense grid. The human fleet's lead elements were converging with the unhurried precision of something that has done this in simulation 400 times, on the Concorde's High Command's own orbital administrative complex. The chamber with the vaulted ceilings and the cold marble floors. The place where a briefing document with a clean, sans serif slide had once called 40,000 lives in efficient trade. No shots were fired at the planetary shield. No attempt was made to breach the grid at all. The human fleet did not need to touch Vheshari Prime's surface to make its point, and it seemed, with a coldness that took Threll's breath, in a way the Cassaday's Reach footage never quite had, entirely uninterested in doing so. They took the high orbital lanes. They took the communication relays that fed Concord High Command's internal network. They took, with a small strike element that moved so precisely it looked almost gentle, the shipyard producing the Concorde's next generation of capital combatants, disabling it without a single hull breach. Because, Threll would learn much later from a captured officer's debrief that eventually filtered down to people at his level, the humans had not come to destroy the Concorde's capacity to build ships. They had come to make it clear they could stop it whenever they chose to. And then, having done all of that in the span of 6 hours, with a precision that made the 9 minutes over Cassaday's Reach look, in retrospect, almost improvised by comparison, they held position again and waited. The peripheral observer who would carry this part of the story afterward, in the version that Concorde civilians would eventually hear whispered rather than officially briefed, was a records clerk named Vheshari Concord, 23 years old, 3 months into her first posting inside the High Command administrative complex, whose entire job until that day had consisted of filing transcripts nobody read. She was in the lower archive level when the human fleet arrived in high orbit, and she did not see any of the fighting because there wasn't any to see. What she experienced instead was the peculiar, disorienting silence of a system going dark floor by floor, first the external relays, then the internal command channels. Then, with a kind of surgical restraint that felt almost more frightening than violence would have, everything except the archive's own local terminals and the building's life support. They had left life support running. Every level, every section. She would think about that detail for years afterward, turn it over the way one turns over a stone one can't quite place the shape of. When the door to the archive level opened 4 hours later, it was not Concorde security. It was 2 human soldiers in matte gray armor, unhurried, weapons slung rather than raised, and behind them a third figure in a plain dark coat who did not look, to Vessa's eye, like a soldier at all. "We're not here for the records," the woman in the coat said, in passable Concorde trade standard, her voice carrying none of the theatrical menace Vessa had braced for. "We're here to make sure nobody in this building does anything foolish in the next 6 hours. That's all. Sit down if you're standing. This won't take long." Vessa sat down. Her hands, she noticed, were flat on the desk in front of her, an old habit from data entry drills, and she found she could not make them move. "What happens in 6 hours?" she asked, because the silence was worse than any answer could be. The woman looked at her for a moment with an expression Vessa would later struggle to describe to anyone, because it did not match any of the emotional registers she had been trained to read in a hostile combatant. Not triumph, not hatred, Something closer, she would eventually decide, to exhaustion carried a very long way and set down carefully so it wouldn't break. Someone talks, the woman said, or nobody does, and we come back with less patience next time. Your leadership gets to choose which. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Vesa would remember, more than anything else about that day, that the woman had spoken to her the way a tired teacher speaks to a student who has finally, after a long and frustrating term, asked the right question. The address, when it came, was broadcast 6 hours later across every channel the Concord used, including several the Concord's own engineers would later confirm humanity should not have had the access codes for. And it was delivered not by a general, not by a head of state with a title long enough to fill a formal introduction, but by a woman whose name the Concord's records would list simply as Fleet Commander, Frontier Response, Reyes. She did not stand before a flag. She did not stand before a fleet or a crowd or any of the visual furniture the Concord's own broadcasts always built around moments of state importance. She sat, alone, at a plain table, in a room that gave away nothing about where it was, and she spoke for 4 minutes. 40,111 people lived at Cassaday's Reach, she said. You have the number wrong in your own reports. I want to start there, because I think it tells you something about how this happened. You called it an efficient trade. You ran a model. The model told you we would read a burning colony as a message and pull back from the frontier because we are, and I am quoting a document your own people wrote, young, sentimental, and reactive. You were half right. We are sentimental. I don't think that's a flaw, and I'm not going to apologize for it. But you mistook grief for weakness, and those are not the same thing. We did not pull back from the frontier because the frontier is not the point. The frontier was never the point. It was always going to be some outpost, some colony, some name on a map you'd never bothered to learn before you decided to make an example of it. We built for that a long time before you chose Cassaday's Reach. We built for it because we understood, the way you apparently did not, that a species that expands into open space will eventually meet someone who reads that expansion as a threat, and that when that happens, the size of your fleet matters less than whether you already knew it was coming. You did not choose Cassaday's Reach because it was strategically significant. You told us so yourselves. You chose it because it was undefended, ordinary, and would make good footage. I've watched the footage. I imagine most of you have too by now from the other side. I am not going to describe what I felt watching it because I don't think you'd understand the answer. And because the people who died there don't need me to perform grief for you as evidence of anything. What I will tell you is what happens now. We are not going to destroy your shipyards. We could have. We're not going to bombard your capital. We could have done that too, and I want to be precise about this because I think precision is the thing your command structure has been missing. We chose not to. Not because we were incapable, but because that isn't what we're here to build. You tried to teach the frontier a lesson about power. I'd like to teach your command a different one, and it's this. There is a difference between silence and stillness. You mistook 9 years of us not answering provocations for an absence of a plan. It was never an absence. It was patience, and patience is not the same thing as permission. From this point forward, the frontier does not shrink. It grows, at the pace it was always going to grow, and any force that moves against another human settlement, anywhere, for any reason, meets this fleet again. And next time we will not be nearly so careful about which of your facilities we leave standing. That is not a threat, it's a schedule. You've seen now that we keep them. I am not interested in your surrender, because surrender implies a war I don't believe either of us actually wants. I am interested in whether your government understands that Cassaday's Reach cost you your entire capacity to surprise us, permanently, and that every calculation you make about us from now on should start from that fact. That's all. Bury your dead if you have any. "We're burying ours." The broadcast ended there, without ceremony, without a closing flourish, the feed simply cutting to static in a way that several Concord analysts would later describe, in internal memos, as more unsettling than any final line could have been. The response that mattered most in the days that followed did not come from Concord High Command, which spent nearly a week in closed session producing nothing more substantive than a formal note protesting the unauthorized incursion into sovereign orbital space, a phrase that several junior officers, Threll among them, found themselves unable to read without a small, bitter twist of something close to laughter, though none of them dared show it. It came from the smaller worlds, the client species, the border colonies, the trade partners who had spent decades operating in the Concord's shadow and had, until that week, never seen anything push against that shadow and not simply die. On a mining moon 3 jumps from Vashon Prime, an elder of the Osawine people, a species the Concorde had annexed into its client structure 4 generations earlier, and had never once, in all that time, treated as anything other than useful, walked out to the edge of a landing field where a single human supply shuttle had set down to deliver medical goods that had nothing to do with the fleet action at all, part of routine frontier trade that had continued, almost defiantly ordinary, throughout the entire crisis. The elder was old enough to remember the annexation firsthand, old enough that his hands shook slightly even at rest, and he did not say anything to the human crew unloading crates. He simply knelt, slowly, with the particular care of a body that has learned exactly how much bending it has left in it, and pressed his palm flat against the tarmac. He held it there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he stood, brushed off his knee, and walked back toward the settlement without a word. The human pilot who witnessed it, a young man named Deacon Ruiz, who would later mention the moment in an interview he gave more out of politeness than any sense of its importance, said only that he hadn't understood what the gesture meant at the time, and that when he'd asked someone from the settlement about it afterward, the answer he'd gotten was simple. He was checking if the ground was still there, the settlement's trade liaison told him. Some of us stopped trusting it a long time ago. Threll Asa Voth resigned his commission 11 months later, quietly, without a public statement, in a letter that named no names and made no accusations, and that fact alone was enough to end whatever career trajectory he might once have expected. He took a civilian position at a small trade monitoring office on a Concord border world, the kind of posting that would once have seemed, to the ambitious young officer he'd been at the tactical rail over Cassaday's reach, like a quiet failure. He did not think of it that way anymore. He kept, in a drawer in his small apartment, a printed copy of his original memo, the one about frontier population movements that hadn't conformed to predicted behavior, and beneath it, added years later, a printed transcript of Fleet Commander Reyes's 4-minute address, which he had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. He did not show either document to anyone. He was not certain, even now, what he would say if someone asked him why he kept them. What he thought, most evenings, sitting with a cup of something bitter and lukewarm, because he had again forgotten it on the counter while he worked, was not about the fleet, or the shipyards, or the 6 hours of silence in the administrative complex. It was about the 9 minutes over Cassaday's reach, and the particular stillness with which he had watched it happen, and the fact that at the time he had believed that stillness meant he had understood what he was seeing. He understood now that he hadn't understood anything. He had watched a strike. He had not understood until 11 days and then 19 days and then 6 hours had taught him, with a patience he still found himself unable to fully describe, that he had also been watching the very beginning of a roll call, and that somewhere very far away, calmly, without any hurry at all, someone had already been marking his name down as present. There was a photograph. He had never learned exactly where it came from, whether it had leaked from human channels or been recovered from Cassaday's Reach's own surviving archives. restored by hands more careful than the Concord's records division had ever been with anything. Of the colony's grain market on an ordinary Tuesday, taken some months before the strike. It showed nothing remarkable. A woman weighing sacks of wheat, a child chasing something out of frame, a man in a wide hat leaning against a post, in no apparent hurry to be anywhere else. Threll had found it once, attached without comment to an old intelligence file he had no reason to still be holding on to. And he had looked at it for a long time before he understood why it unsettled him more than the footage of the strike itself ever had. It was so ordinary. It contained no warning of what was coming, and needed none, because ordinary was the entire point. The ordinary would have gone on being ordinary forever, would have simply added more market days and more children chasing things out of frame. If someone very far away and very confident in a model on a slide had not decided that ordinary made for good footage. He thought some evenings about the elder on the mining moon, kneeling to press a palm against tarmac that had, for once, held. He thought about the woman at the plane table who had corrected the death toll before she said anything else, because she had wanted them to know that the number itself mattered, that 40,011 were not close enough to round away. He did not think the Concorde had learned the lesson it believed it had taught. He thought instead that it had finally, belatedly, been shown one, and that the difference between those two things was the entire story, if anyone up the chain had ever cared to hear it told properly. The tea had gone cold again. He drank it anyway, because that was, in the end, a very small and very ordinary thing to do, and there was a kind of dignity in doing the small ordinary things regardless, in going on setting the table and pouring the drink and sitting down to it, in the quiet insistence that the ground, however much it might have shaken, was still there to sit on. Outside, the border world's single moon was rising over a market that would open again in the morning, unremarkable, unhurried, and still, against every model anyone had ever run against it, standing.